our co-worker, my colleague, Barry, has put in the links to the handouts and the resources. So you should have access to the folder, and in there are more resources that are actually in the PowerPoint, as well as a PDF of the PowerPoint as well. So let me know if you are having trouble getting to those, and Barry will be able to help you with that too in the chat. So you should have everything you need in there.
And if I could just interject, those are the same
Sure.
resources that might have been emailed to you. So if you had access to that, if not, obviously they're there. And one more thing, we are recording this session. So if down the road you want to come back to look at it, or if you've got colleagues who couldn't attend today, it'll be recorded. So thank you.
Yes, and if you're just joining, Barry was letting everybody know that we are recording, and in the chat is a link to all the resources as well. So we have everything in there, and plus extra things that are not actually in the presentation. So I tried to put extra things in there, different samples that I'm going to mention in the PowerPoint. So hopefully you have a wealth of information in there. So if you can, join us for our remaining sessions that are part of our Community School PD series. We have 2 more left, March 1st and March 8th. As you can see, they're highlighted in red. That's our MTSS basics and our student attendance data. So hopefully you can join us for those. We are recording all of these sessions. So if you missed any of the other sessions, they will be uploaded and on our YouTube site for or ST11. And hopefully you can join us and catch up with us on there. So again, I am really apologizing for my voice today, and this is my first day back. So hopefully my voice isn't too distracting. So a bit of housekeeping, please mute your mic, but do feel free to ask questions by unmuting or contributing within the chat. I really like to hear your ideas. And if you have a question or need clarification throughout, feel free to raise your hand or just unmute and ask. That does not bother me at all. This is really interactive, and I like to hear your thoughts. So again, that leads into participate. Your ideas are always welcome and they're necessary. Creating that sharing community between colleagues, that's what leads to a richer exchange of learning experiences and ideas. And all the way throughout, reflect and share. So take notes or jot down ideas that you can share here or when you go back to your districts. And always feel free to contact me for follow-up, or if you think of something later and you would like to share it or follow up and have a question, please reach out and to anybody here, and we will be more than happy to answer a question or follow up over phone, Zoom, or in person or email, or however best suits your schedule. A little bit about me. My name is Susan Webb, and I am new here at the state support team. But I'm not new to education. I have been working in education for 23 years. I have done everything from being a teacher with a rolling cart, going from classroom to classroom and listening over the intercom to see where my class will be held that day. I started out in a small Catholic school in Northern Kentucky, teaching theater and English. I went back and got my intervention specialist and went from that into administration and then into mental health. And that's where I've really lived in that mental health world for a long time. I've worked as an assistant principal, district mental health coordinator, administrator of special programming, and I just moved back from Texas. I've worked in Kentucky as well, and I trained in Ohio. So it's good to be back in Ohio. I have a daughter. She's at Ohio Wesleyan and plays in the band there. And I am, like I said, just really glad to be back in Ohio and working with Ohio schools and students and families and teachers. So I am really glad to be here. Our learning goals today are to acquire insight into the co-teach and co-learn approach to instruction. We're going to look at building skills and strategies that really work to improve student success and those co-teaching practices that influence success. And we're going to analyze our current practices as administrators and educators and reflect on how that contributes to improving student incomes, as well as what are we going to do as next steps. So we're going to jump right in. Co-teach to co-learn. What is it and why do we do it? So I hope you have heard of Marilyn Friend. She's kind of the guru of co-teach to co-learn. These are two quotes that from her, one from 2014 and one from 2019 when she was at the Council of Exceptional Children. The first one talks about really what she feels is the most integral part of co-teaching, and that's the collaborative planning, because she really feels if you are not providing that collaborative planning process, if that doesn't exist and you are providing co-teaching, then you're not really providing co-teaching. If you look up there at that quote, it really affects the content, the instructional delivery, the assessment of student learning. It's really when that combined expertise comes to fruition. And she talks about how important that is. Co-teaching was started back in the 80s. That's when it really was, it came into being. But if you know the history of co-teaching, it fell, it kind of flopped. And why, if you listen to her speak, it's because it wasn't implemented with fidelity. And one of the main things was the lack of planning, and that combined planning and combined expertise. It was really that you had a general ed teacher and then a divide with the special education teacher, and it was very separate. And so that's why she touts that collaborative planning, that co-planning part so much. The second quote, when she talks about the promise of co-teaching, that was in 2019, and she was being interviewed about co-teaching and kind of talking about that element. And she said there's a dual goal there. And that promise, and what it had promised was these wonderful outcomes, and why that didn't happen. And she said, you know, there's a dual promise there. And the first goal is to provide students with disabilities meaningful access to the general curriculum in that least restrictive environment with their peers. And at the same time, they have to receive this specially designed instruction to which they are entitled. So just by putting them in the classroom is not going to give you success. You have to have those two dual things happening at once. And so many times that wasn't happening. They were just placed in the classroom. And just because you give them two teachers and you don't provide the implementation process with fidelity, you're not going to get what you want. So she talked a little bit about that implementation process and the foundations of it. And that wasn't provided in the 80s. And that's why you had that disconnect and the lack of success there. So we have a recipe for co-teaching. You have two professionals, two certified professionals in that room who share teaching responsibilities, but they're different. They have different areas of expertise, but you have a combined delivery. And if you look at a recipe, it's a process. It's a very specific ingredients that have to be combined. You know, I'm a fan of the Great British Bake Off, and you know, you look at sometimes when they're baking, they say you can't whip the eggs into the batter too much, you'll whip all the air out of it. And you'll watch some of the bakers who are in that technical, and they're just whipping away, and they're, you know, their cake's going to fall because, Well, they whipped all the air out of it. They didn't follow the instructions. They didn't do it with fidelity. And so when you don't combine the delivery in the way it's supposed to be combined, you're not using your professionals in the right way. You have to have strong administrative support. Administrators who understand the process, and they support co-teaching, and they empower their teachers to lead, and they promote an inclusive, equitable environment. Well, if you do those two things, you have those things in place, the result is going to be success for your students. Not only your students with disabilities, but their peers as well. All your students will achieve much better. You elevate that for all your students. Here's a list of who can be a partner in co-teaching in that instructional delivery model. And look at that list. I know, I kind of, when I was in education, earlier in my years, I really didn't think about some of these people. Yeah, the gifted, talented teacher, probably the special education teacher, ELL teachers. But some of these people on the list kind of surprised me. You don't really maybe think of other people being part of that co-teaching process. But it's not limited to just the special education teacher. There are other people that can be a part of your co-teaching teams. Do any of these surprise you? Maybe throw that in the chat if any of these people surprise you. Kind of reflect on that a minute. I know I was surprised when I first was delivered that information, or somebody brought this to my attention. So I'm curious, and feel free to unmute or put it in chat, but as an administrator, as a teacher, what has been your experience with co-teaching? Either great or not so great. Have you had experiences with co-teaching that have gone well, or maybe have not gone? They've been like the 80s, they didn't go so well, and this could be something that you were involved in directly or you observed. Feel free to unmute and share, or put it in the chat for us to kind of see. Anyone had any experiences?
So like this is our, can you turn that? This is our first year like implementing co-teaching. And it's been actually very successful, like planning with the general education teacher. The thing that we seem to struggle the most with is trying to figure out which approach works best for our students. So it's kind of been a lot of trial and error with that.
Okay. So which model, which style, which model to follow? And I think that's always, that can be a kind of a difficult thing to decide on. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different styles, the different models, and kind of what might work for what situation as well. Good, thanks for contributing. Anybody else? I know, personally, when I first changed over from the small Catholic school to the public school, and that was when I had just finished my intervention specialist, I went into the classroom as a co-teacher, and I worked with two different teachers. And I think It was the first year they had started co-teaching and they didn't really know how they wanted to set it up. So, it was a experiment and I had two different teachers and, it was a very different experience. It was in a senior English. I had been an English teacher, so I went in with this special education perspective. And I went into two different classrooms at the senior English level, with two very different teachers who had two very different perspectives on how they wanted this to work, and no administrative guidelines about how it should look. So it was a very interesting year for me, especially being a new intervention specialist and having that English background and trying to feel my own way too with the special education, being new under my belt too. So it was very different. And I think we had difficulties trying to figure out what mode we were going to use as well, since there was no real pathway and what would work and all that kind of thing too. So that's difficult. I can feel that. Okay. So co-teaching, what it is and what it's not. So if you look to the left, what it is matches up with what it's not on the right. And I think that if we kind of go down that list, co-responsibility for planning, it is that co-responsibility for both teachers and the planning, instructional delivery, assessment, and the management. It's not just one teacher responsible for all of that. And I think sometimes it can be, and why that might be is generally the general ed teacher has been responsible for the management of the classroom. Lots of times the delivery of the instruction. What it is part of the continuum of services for students with disabilities. So it's a part of that. It's not just creating a small class inside of a larger one. We're not isolating those students. Two teachers plan when each co-teaching model will be used in the lesson. So I want to kind of think about that for a second. When each co-teaching model, we don't necessarily have to decide we're going to do this model or that model. We can change it up depending on our needs of our students. It's not just one teacher leading and the other merely assisting either. So we're not doing that model. In fact, we're going to get into why that's not good. Both teachers being responsible for all students within the classroom. They're our students when we're co-teaching. I think this is what happened when co-teaching first started. One teacher working only with the students with disabilities. That's separation. Both teachers planning lessons to meet the needs of all learners. That co-planning. I think a lot of times what's happened in some settings is there is the second teacher becomes that extra set of hands to help with tasks. And that's not what we want either. So that going back to that, why do we do it? Well, if we're looking at the benefits for students, there are lots of curriculum benefits. Students with disabilities gain access to the general education curriculum. There's enhanced academic performance. And boy, look in Ohio, what we want is that literacy achievement. We've seen increased literacy achievement when we place students in co-teaching situations. Social, reduce stigma. We're not pulling them out and isolating the students. Positive effects on in their own minds too. They can do more. They're with their peers. We're looking at that whole child in Ohio. There's your social connection. They receive more teacher attention, of course, and we are able to identify learning problems much earlier. And of course, the increased individual attention and instruction. Teachers benefit as well. Their ability to intensify instruction, reduce discipline issues, of course, the student-teacher ratio, professional growth. There's more personal and professional if it's support, if it's done with fidelity, opportunities for professional growth. And there's evidence that the willingness to try new things and be more creative. And of course, all of those different collaborative elements are in place when we implement with fidelity. There are also school-wide benefits. You unite your staff. Parent satisfaction is increased. And feeling a community within general education classrooms, that's increased as well. And you see that enhancement. So feel free to unmute or put this in chat too. What's been the most important point or points from this section, and thinking about co-teaching as a service delivery model that maybe you could take back to your school or your district? Is there anything that maybe stood out in that section that we just went over? Did anything strike you or stand out to you? Betty? Okay. Okay, so we're going to get into the co-teaching models. So there are 6 of them. We can kind of look at them there. We're going to get into each one of them and what they look like, and some of the disadvantages and the benefits of each one of them. So if we look at them and compare them, station teaching. So when we talk about station teaching, this one is the one that's used most frequently. And content is complex, but not necessarily hierarchical. It utilizes the learning centers with different lessons. It is, it helps to cover several topics. And especially when the lessons can be segmented. It increases that in student engagement. More material can be covered in a shorter time. You can subdivide those sections and give tasks for different stations. One of the disadvantages, it does take sufficient planning time, and problems with timing can occur. Direct support is available to many students, which is a plus. And you can also collect observational data easier from the stations to help adjust that instruction. Is anybody using stations frequently? This is one of the ones that should be most frequently used because of the many benefits. This also allows you to put students into groups. You can rearrange those groups depending on your subject matter, so they don't have to be the stagnant groups. When you're getting that observational data, collecting the data, you can change your groups by need. It allows teachers to develop different rapport with different students, get to know your students. And again, collecting that different bits of data and work with students in different ways. This one is one, again, that should be used pretty frequently compared to the other models. If you're not using it, it's one that really should be used quite frequently. And it allows a lot of independent work for some of the students that can go a little above and beyond too. So when we look at parallel teaching, so you're dividing the students into two groups, and they can work in small groups. Oh, whoops, sorry about that. Things touchy there. And both teachers are presenting the same material, but it allows for the differentiation and student participation. The students have a lot of individualized attention, and it allows for better supervision. So whereas station teaching, you may have a lot of noise. You still may get the noise with this one, but you have a little more supervision with the parallel teaching. You are still teaching the same lesson in parallel teaching, where station teaching, you may be teaching different material. So you have a little more planning with your station teaching. Parallel teaching, you've got the same lesson. Groups are more aligned to the specific needs of your students. So you may have specific needs that you're working on with this group and that group, and you can adapt those lessons for those two groups. And you can get into more discussion, deeper discussions, because you're not rotating as much. Test reviews are good. Reteaching skills are good for this. Drill and practice. Debate and discussion might be a good use of this type of group. So again, when we're talking about not staying with one model, using different models, it's good to change it up. You don't have to stick with one model. And that's why the planning is so important, because you want to look at your lesson and see what is going to fit the type of lesson I need to teach for this skill, for this type of instruction that I need to teach this lesson. And so we don't need to stay with one model. It gives each teacher an active but separate role in the classroom. But it does give that equivalent delivery. The pacing needs to be in sync because you have the same lesson going on. That is one thing. So that planning is going to be very necessary for this. Strategic placing of the students in the groups is very important. Again, the noise level has to be managed. And planning for the different needs can take time. And then putting the students into groups is also very strategic because you have to know which students are going to work best in which group. Any questions about parallel teaching and how it differs from station teaching? Alternative teaching. So in alternative teaching, you're going to have one teacher instruct the larger group of students, while the other instructs a smaller group that has much more specific needs. So when you have a group that needs maybe more remediation or additional scaffolding, additional practice, enrichment, or pre-teaching of concepts, maybe extra vocabulary work, that's when you might need alternative teaching. So you've got a different lesson going on than what's going on for the majority of students. The majority of students, then you have this smaller group that may be pulled to the back of the room. The benefits of that are differentiated instruction. The smaller group may occur inside the room or be outside the classroom. So you are taking the students away from the majority. Again, the disadvantages with that are one group may feel different or isolated from the other group. So we wouldn't want to use the alternative teaching as often as maybe the station teaching or even the parallel teaching. Those are our more frequent uses. And so we would use this one more sparingly, but it is something, it is an option to use should we need to remediate or scaffold or really dig deeper into a skill for a certain group of students. So that's when we might use that skill. So one teach, one support, or you might note as one teach, one assist. One student would, or one teacher delivers that instruction and the other one runs the room giving support to students. This is the one Marilyn Friend would say, we don't want to use this one very often at all. This should be your least frequent model to use. Why? It really can become a dependent kind of model for students. And it does offer individual help. It allows behavior to be easily observed. Those are two benefits. But it is very much the unequal power distribution. And students learn to have that immediate help. They also may become very distracted while the lesson is going on. And that creates a dependency as well. So this is one, if you use it, it should be very, very infrequent. And it should be for very specific reasons that you utilize it. The one teach, one observe. Again, this one is used really when you want to collect data. So one teacher would be delivering that instruction while one teacher observes and collects data. And it should not just be the special education teacher, but the general education teacher can collect that data as well. It allows usable data for any sort of data-based decision making for the instructional delivery of planning for that instruction, or any sort of decisions that you're going to make regarding students. It does take one of the teachers out of the instructional contact with students. So always keep that in mind, and it should be used strategically. Data collection, very important. But any ways that that data can be collected through maybe station teaching, parallel teaching, any other ways that that data can be collected should be considered before utilizing the one teach, one observe. Sometimes you may need to do it. You may need to collect it on many students at once. You may need to collect it specifically for a purpose on one or two students. And that is the way you're going to have to do it. But use it sparingly is what the research tells us, what the experts tell us. And it doesn't have to be just the special education teacher. It can be the general ed teacher. So team teaching, sorry about that, is one that we see used a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best one to use either. That's two teachers working together to deliver the instruction. It is a good one to use, and we should see it as a fluid. You should be able to see who is the lead teacher really when it's used. It should be fluid. Teachers should be equals, and both can manage the behavior. So it's good to use so that teachers earn the respect of both the students, or all the students. Both teachers do. And it should happen occasionally. Absolutely. The disadvantages that sometimes students can play the teachers. Sometimes teachers can, when they don't have that base relationship, so they can step on each other's toes until they have that set relationship. So it also doesn't allow for the differentiation sometimes to happen, or the SDI to happen. So you have to make sure that all the needs are being met. And that is really, really key. It should be used occasionally, absolutely. That two heads is better than one experience is important. And when there's a high sense of comfort between the two teachers. So making sure that that relationship's in place is really important, that one. And that you're going to be able to still deliver the SDI, and that all the needs are going to be met. So really what the experts recommend is station teaching and parallel teaching, that those are complemented by the other models. And again, you don't have to stick with one model. You should kind of change it up every once in a while. And so really that should be driven by the type of lesson you're teaching, the instructional needs of your students, and your goals that you're trying to accomplish. And so that really goes back to what Marilyn Friend was saying, the co-planning process and looking at your goals that you're trying to achieve and what is being driven by the SDI and the needs of your students. Are there any questions about the models or how they kind of work interchangeably, or how you decide on utilizing the models? Any comments on the models? I think in your resources, I've provided some different information on the models and about decision-making and how to go about kind of looking into them as well. So you can kind of delve a little more into them through those resources.
But Susan, I know when I was a building principal, once we used the team teaching approach frequently, and one of the goals when they were using the team teaching approach was for just like an observer to walk in and not know who the gen ed teacher
Yes.
was and who the IS was. They were, and the concept was that they could work with any of the kids. So not only could they support the students on IEPs, but they could also help any of the kids in the classroom. And that was an effective model when the teachers worked together well.
Yes. And that is something when we get into the administrative part that should be seamless. Absolutely. So we're going to get into kind of that relationship building and the look fors for for anybody that walks in, not just administrators, but anybody that walks in should be able to see all the kids reacting to both teachers as equals, and building that relationship is so key to that. Good point. Thanks, Barry. So strategies and practices. As Barry was saying, that these things really have to be in place for all that to be successful. And without all these components in place, problems will occur because these are kind of the foundations to effective co-teaching. Everyone should have knowledge. Everyone in the building really should have knowledge of the 6 approaches. And the classroom logistics, that environment should be conducive to co-teaching. And we're going to get into kind of what the classroom logistics should look like. That means both teachers in that room should have space. And it should be set up so that co-teaching can effectively occur. Quality instruction, that's key. It has to be high quality instruction because that's one of the most important components. SDI is embedded in quality instruction. That's how we emphasize it. And the roles of each teacher, those professional roles, they're both professionals and each one has expertise. And when they combine like a good recipe, that's where you get that real success and that supportive environment from planning to making the environment work. That's on the administrators to help support that. So that high quality tier 1 instruction must be in place. So I'm not going to get too much into that because I think we all know what high quality instruction is. Opportunities to respond, assessments that guide instruction, to differentiation. That's for all learners, not just our students with disabilities, all learners. And classroom procedures that guide learning and instruction. That's classroom procedures for behavior management and even how you get your pencils, how you walk in the room, how you turn in your work. All of those things have to be in place because they support your instruction. Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. If you go to cast.org, that is a wonderful site for when you are planning to help you involve universal design when you are wanting to involve differentiation and making sure that you hit all the needs of your learners. They have great templates. They have wonderful ideas for incorporating differentiation. Just for hitting all of those marks, I recommend highly checking that webpage out, going to them, looking through that website, and they will have all kinds of resources. Just even if planning with your co-teacher, go to that site and really look into the tools and the resources that they have. They are so helpful in incorporating UDL into your lesson planning. Data, using data authentic data to guide your instruction. So again, we talked about, you know, the observing and that model, using it infrequently, but it is important to collect that data, having a plan to collect data and finding ways to do it, not just by observing, but also how are you going to collect it in your stations, in your models. Having that plan and planning with your co-teacher to collect that data is really important. And then going over that and letting it help you guide your instructional practices. Understanding the roles, making sure that everybody has a clear idea of the roles and how they combine to make that expertise. The learning specialist, what are you responsible for as the learning specialist? Adapting modifications, your SDI, specific interventions, language acquisition. Content experts, what is the responsibility of the content expert? And then combining that into enhancing the content, access to rigorous instruction, and support for all learners. Making sure that those all combine into that combined expertise, but having those clear expectations for each role. Because one is just as important as the other in a co-teaching situation. The special educator, this kind of breaks that down even further. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but just understanding you are the advocate for the special education students' needs within the LRE, that should say within, but that learner profile, you are the expert on those students with disabilities. While the general education teacher needs to know the students with disabilities, you're the expert on them, and having that real true understanding of any psychologicals or any paperwork that is within their profile, and really being able to advocate for them. So that's truly part of what your responsibility is in that classroom, to be that voice for that student. Again, we're going back to the co-planning. Dedicated weekly time. So when we say dedicated, that's the time that needs to happen every week. If not every week, there needs to be other time set aside. I know weekly is ideal, but if not weekly, there has to be a dedicated time. And those are the things that have to happen in that co-planning time. Relationships are built, pedagogies, philosophies aligned, and professional development. The co-instructing. This is why that co-planning is so important. And that's where you can continuously evaluate the co-teaching relationship. It's not just a one-off, oh, we're going to meet in the summer, get to know each other, and then we're off. It has to be continuously evaluated. Continuous reflecting on the practice and seeking assistance and support as needed. So one thing to keep in mind, you are the adults in the room. Sometimes you're the only role model for your students. Your relationship is one of the adult relationships that some of these students see, one of the only ones that may be healthy. So keeping that relationship healthy is truly important. We're going to come back to this, but I want you to look at these barriers. And I want you to just to think about these, because we're going to talk about these later. And there may be more barriers that you can think of. And if you can, just kind of jot those down. But sometimes these are perceived barriers as to why co-teaching won't work. Not enough time or issues with scheduling. physical space. We don't have enough space to allow for co-teaching. We don't have enough skilled people in the building or experience, but this won't work. People aren't going to get along. There's too many philosophical differences. We don't have students that are going to work with groupings. There are lots of other barriers that we can probably name, and I want you to kind of think of those. And we'll come back to this later, but lots of times we can think of many reasons not to co-teach. So how do we build strong partnerships? When we're thinking of co-teaching partnerships, there are 3 stages that Gately and Gately name: beginning, compromising, and collaborative. We have to start out somewhere, we kind of compromise, getting in that compromising stage, and then we finally get to a real true collaborative stage in our partnerships. It's not always a perfect match. Sometimes it seems like we'll never get to the collaborative stage. So if you are in a collaborative co-teaching situation, I want you to kind of think, are you a yes, but person or more of a yes and person? Meaning when somebody asks you to maybe try something, do you respond with a, yeah, but I'd like, or do you respond with a, yes, and I'll do? So kind of think, what's your initial reaction? Are you more open-minded, or do you kind of put up a defensive response in your head? Sometimes it's hard when we're set. We're going to watch a quick video. And this is kind of thinking about co-teaching being like a marriage. These are 2 teachers that have been working together for a while. And we're going to watch just a portion of this video, but they talk about what it was like to kind of work together, develop this relationship. And we're going to kind of talk about it afterwards. I want you to kind of think about what you're looking at and point out some of the things they did to kind of work together.
So Ms. Price and I, when we met over the summer, really had to look at our relationship like a marriage, and an arranged marriage at that one. Ms. Price moved into our home, or should I say our classroom, over the summer, and she immediately started decorating, and as you can see, she's so stylish and very colorful, and it doesn't necessarily go with my black and white Wednesday Addams aesthetic, but I was welcome to her coming in. Somehow, a very colorful, our classroom is awesome sign ended up over on my side, and this was my first marital test. I had to really let go of the idea that education teaches us that the general education teacher owns the classroom, and that it's their classroom, and that our special education teacher and their students are just a guest. So in a small token of showing her that this was our space, that sign still lives on my side.
Well, that's because I like that sign, and our classroom is awesome. It's awesome because we actually had to develop a friendship. I didn't know Miss Heck in June, May last year. I met Miss Heck in July. And we had to take the time to really learn each other. We had to communicate. Like she said, we come from 2 different backgrounds. I only know special education. At least you've had the opportunity of doing special education as well. But all I know is special education. I'm going to advocate for students with disabilities. I appreciate that we took the time on day 1, like when we had the pre-planning, We said, these are the things that we're gonna do on day one when we come in this class. I made it clear. Let them know that there are 2 teachers in the class, because I hate when the general education teacher is outside the classroom. The kids tend to believe that there's a party going on in here, and I'm like, hey, y'all got 2 teachers in this class, and they're like, oh, I thought you was just in here observing. But I appreciate that we took the time to establish, you have 2 teachers in this classroom, and if one of us not in there, class is still gonna go on.
One of the first conversations that we had as partners was what was going to be important in our classroom. Of course, the content, but what was also going to be paramount to both of us was our relationship, not just with students, but with each other. We talked about the fact that we have 124 seniors that are about to become people of the workforce, college students, military members, and for a lot of them, we are the healthiest adult relationship that they see. And it's so important for them to see 2 people, like you said, Ms. Price, who are completely different, coming together to be able to be successful in the classroom.
Again, we have to communicate. We develop a level of respect. I don't always agree with what Ms. Heck does. I know that Ms. Heck follows the rules. Certain things that bother her don't bother me. But I know that when I'm in the classroom with her, we're going to enforce those rules. So conflict does happen. We don't agree. I can't stress that. We don't agree on everything. And we had to learn that when there was a problem in our class, it wasn't always sunshine. I can't even.
I remember one time I looked over at Miss Price and I could feel the energy was a little off, and I said, Miss Price, are we in a fight?
And I said, yes, we are. I mean, yes, we are. This head, girl. Next time, let's come up with a cue. Just look at me, something, because I wasn't ready. And I thank you for giving me that moment.
I certainly gave her that moment, but I let her know that you can never go to bed angry and that this relationship was worth salvageing. Because some things we really put to make our relationship work is really trying to learn the other side. Ms. Price works with me all the time in writing our lesson plans and putting her hand on them, making sure that she knows what we're teaching and telling me where she feels comfortable coming in. And she let me come in to write IEPs with her. Now, special education teachers are always using the line, I have so much paperwork. And when Ms. Price let me in, I saw she has so much paperwork. And it gave me such an eye-opening view to what she does and how hard she really works.
Do you know why I have a lot of paperwork?
Why do you have so much paperwork?
So I manage a caseload. So these are students that I'm actually responsible for at any school that I've been in. I'm fortunate enough here that my caseload is rather small.
So what were the things you noticed about their relationship, how they developed their relationship? Any specific strategies they use to develop or keep the relationship going? Feel free to unmute or stick something in chat that you noticed. Or any role modeling they did. They were intentional. Good. Intentional in that developing the relationship. They made allowances for each other's differences, for sure, definitely. I like the part about how they were really aware that they had seniors who were getting ready to go off into the world and be citizens. And so their relationship and how they treated each other was important because they were role models. How they handled conflict or how they treated each other was important because that may be an example of to those students who are getting ready to go off and have jobs or go off into the military or wherever they were going to go. And they were cognizant of that, and they wanted to be good role models for those students. That impressed me too. And they admitted it wasn't always, sunshine, I think as she said. They were very real about that. They may notice they developed a signal. So if they needed to talk about something, or something wasn't going right, they had a signal. So they knew they needed to talk about something afterwards. That didn't happen. That happened organically after the first kind of miscommunication. What happens sometimes with people, that doesn't happen. Sometimes what happens is it just festers, right? And so we have to be the adults in the room and think about how we handle those miscommunications. I think we've all been in education long enough to know that doesn't always happen. Things will fester with people sometimes when it's not handled correctly. Anybody else? If anybody thinks of anything or wants to pop it in chat later, go ahead and do that. So I think, they have a good little TED Talk about their relationship and how it, started and different things like that. Just wanted to show you a little sample. I'll put that video in the resources later. So some of what they did was handle the miscommunication, how they learned about each other, embracing their differences. We talked a little bit about that. So setting up that relationship, we want to do these things. We want to encourage people to do these things. Take time to know each other, the good, the bad, and the ugly, establishing clear roles and responsibilities. Work out the differences in private. Remember, those eyes are watching, the little eyes, the big eyes. They're watching. Highlight the solution and not the disagreement. That's easy to do, to get mired in the what went wrong instead of really focusing on how you're going to move forward. And give each other space. If you notice, one thing she did was she gave her time and space, both physical and mental, and then went on to look at that solution. Sometimes if we're the kind of person we want closure and to fix things immediately, that may not be your co-teacher. They may need time and space first. It's just like a marriage. We have to know our partner. So making sure you really know somebody and establish those parameters at the beginning is really important. In your resources, there are some surveys and getting to know you forms, which may seem kind of cheesy at first, but it really is important to get to know your partner, especially if you don't already know them at the beginning, and really get to know that person, even maybe if you've taught in the same building with them. Know them on a more personal level is really important to establishing a good co-teaching marriage. So one of the things you don't want to do is excluding your partner from the co-planning. Earlier in the video, if you'd seen the whole thing, she talks about, you don't want to walk into a situation. And she said she's been married many times before. She walked into situations where she has no idea what's going on in the classroom. And that really leaves her feeling not very empowered to be a part of that teaching situation. You don't need to feel as if you know all the content, but understanding what's on the menu for that day and being a part of that process, because you're not the content expert if you're the special educator, but understanding the process and knowing what's going on is important. You don't want to ignore the value of UDL. Again, can't recommend CAS.org enough. You don't want to get lost in the curriculum and lose focus on the core concepts when you're planning with your teachers. Really look at what is the important stuff. What are the important concepts? And don't blame the schedule for not finding the time to practice or to co-plan. If you can't physically find the time, there are lots of ways, virtual or other ways that you can find the time. It may not be ideal, but co-planning is really important. Finding that shared time. So co-planning at every level, mega, macro, and micro. Mega means for the whole year. If you have a good plan for the entire year, and then in more for a semester, and then those micro plans are going to come much easier. So what's your scope and sequence? You're going to spend less time on those micro plans. HLPs, reflect before you respond. Record and share anecdotal notes that you take. All this sharing and co-planning at every level is so important. And always be willing to learn. Learn from your partner. Make sure you're sharing things with your partner. They're more willing to share with you. So as I said, you have self-assessment forms in your folder. Samples, these are just 2 samples. There are more in there, lots of reflective forms. I think you have probably 10 or 11 in there. Find what works for you and your partner. Periodically self-assess, not just once or twice, but periodically through the year. Compare your results and discuss differences. Discussion should lead to goals for a growth plan and monitor that plan for effectiveness. That should lead to changes in instructional deliveries and the instructional practices. There are lesson planning forms in there for co-teaching, different ones, sample forms, sample lessons. This is one for middle school math. There's some high school and elementary forms in there. And then there's some special guides for special education and SDI. And really think about the SDI and what is being provided. This should be kind of a reflection every time you're co-planning about your intentions for SDI and why you're providing it, how you're providing it. So we talked about the principal and the administrator playing an important role in supporting. In fact, the principal and the administrator leads the paradigm shift. So while the teachers are the effective leaders within the classroom, they have to be supported by a strong administrator, because that is the paradigm shift within the culture of the buildings. The administrators establish the culture. Before working on communication and collaboration, administrators need to change the whole mindset and the culture within their schools. Co-teaching doesn't succeed unless that happens. Inclusion really is an act of equity and social justice, and that's imperative to student success. That needs to be the message to everybody in your district and your building. So developing a district-wide or even building-wide understanding of co-teaching is imperative. Everyone needs to understand that importance and the mission of co-teaching. Your entire staff really needs to understand all those models and the best practices for co-teaching if you're going to really have success. It can't just be your co-teachers that have that understanding of what is going on in that classroom. That importance in those models and really what's going on needs to be understood by everybody on some level. So when you're looking at that, and after that's been established, you have to look at what are my strategies for scheduling? Equally distributing the number of students within the special needs with special needs between classroom has to be a priority. That means not overloading your best co-teaching team with all your special needs students, your 504s, all your at-risk students. When we do that, that becomes where we have our burnout of teachers. We lose our strongest teachers. We also need to assign, especially when we're first starting out, one special educator to one general ed teacher, maybe two, especially when we're first starting out and building our programs. And limiting that number of content area and grade levels in which that special educator co-teaches, especially when we're starting out. As we're building and we're getting stronger, we can increase that somewhat. Creating that common planning time is key. You have to make time for common planning times that is dedicated, not taken away for, meetings or different things. Look for, if they don't have a common planning time, look for PLCs or replace lunch or recess duties. That's really key to find that time. Find ways to create that, especially when you're starting these programs. You have to find a way to prioritize that. You have to look at partnering the right people too. So providing the expectation parameters for co-teaching. That's going to be up to you to provide that. Consider allowing teachers to choose their partners after they've been presented with those expectations and parameters. Utilize surveys and personality inventories to help you pair the teachers if you don't want to go that route, and allowing volunteers to choose. Maybe hold events such as lunches or TGIF parties to help partners get to know each other and form bonds. But partnering the right people is really, really key, with that understanding that it does take time to build those relationships and those bonds, and that might not happen immediately. That's going to take nurturing. As the administrator, you need to help strategically supervise and evaluate. So making sure that you as the administrator really understand what co-teaching is and what it isn't, and all parts of the process, the co-planning, the co-instructing, and the co-assessing. Evaluations may involve looking for differentiation. As Barry had mentioned earlier, that inability to detect which teacher is leading instruction or that regrouping has occurred. You should be able to walk into a classroom when you're doing an evaluation and really not know who is leading that instruction. That really should be the test of good co-teaching going on. Also, when you're doing an evaluation, do both evaluations of the teachers at once to allow for a true co-teaching experience. Don't schedule one teacher and then another teacher. Do it all at once. It should be seamless. That's real collaboration. That process should mirror that co-teaching experience. So when we're looking at realistic administrative support within phases, the beginning phase of any administrative support should look something like this. As the administrator, you're going to establish a supportive culture around collaboration and co-teaching. You want to acknowledge teacher expertise. That's really key, is acknowledging your teacher's expertise. You want to establish a growth mindset. Choice and flexibility within parameters. And what does that mean? You want to give teachers autonomy, and you can. So by allowing them to have a concept of shared leadership, to make collaborative decisions, to take ownership of their classrooms, to let them really take charge of their classroom, and kind of lead that divvying of the roles and responsibilities within parameters should be your goal. Let them have that leadership role there. Choice and flexibility within there, within those parameters. That is important. Promote shared leadership within the dyads, within that coupling. That power to accomplish shared goals is really important. The co-teachers should be included within that decision-making at the school level. That's modeling that shared leadership. Allow them to share their vision of what a successful classroom looks like. Resource allocation. Make sure that they have that access to the resources that they need, technology and tools, workspaces within their classroom, that they have either adjoining offices or they have the space within those classrooms that allows them to work as a team. And be proactive about sources of conflict. So if there is a conflict, make sure that they've discussed the issues and that they are on the track to solving those conflicts. Step in if needed, but allow them to have ownership, but allow them to know that you are there to support them. Don't take that hands off. Oh, it'll work itself out. But don't be overstepping if they can work it out. The middle phase, individual reflection opportunities for learning, that's really important. Professional development is so important. Providing that is truly part of your position. Shared reflection opportunities for individual growth, allocating time for that co-planning, keeping it going. Provide regularly scheduled feedback. That is something that will sink a ship if you don't allow time for them to come to you or you to come to them and check in. How is it going? What do you need? Assess the student progress, setting instructional goals and checking in with that structured framework. Does it need tweaking? How are we moving along in that process? Again, meaningful professional development opportunities. Meaningful. What do they need? instead of just deciding that they're going to do this, what is needed, assessing that frequently. Being proactive in managing the conflicts in a proactive manner in the middle phase is important. It's important in the beginning phase and in the middle phase. Even if you think they have an established relationship, allowing them to come to you for support and letting them know that you are still there for them is important too. Sometimes during times of growth is when we see the most conflicts. So being aware of that and not just taking a hands-off approach is the role of the administrator. So the during and the after phase, this is important to recognize and celebrate the successes of your teams. This is really important. A lot of times we don't celebrate our successes, and that's really, really important. Public acknowledgements, personal notes, however you want to celebrate, but our strong teams need to be acknowledged somehow, celebrated. Job well performed. Teachers need that. We need to celebrate them. Success stories. Reflect on all phases of the implementation to assess the next steps, which could include having those successful teams be your mentors and your models. Again, don't dump on them though. They need to be your models and your mentors, but they don't need to be your workhorses. They need to be the ones helping the next generation and those people coming in to be your next teams. So sometimes we forget and we decide, oh, well, this person's good. We're going to pair them with a new person. Keeping our stellar teams together is really important. Using them as models is key. Dividing our teams, because they're only going to get better as they work together. They're like wine. We need to keep them together and keep them aging together because they're only going to get better. So keeping teams together is really important. Also thinking about those next steps. What if you leave, how are you going to institutionalize what you're creating as an administrator? What processes do you have in place that's going to keep that culture of inclusion and co-teaching thriving? Who are the persons that understand the processes and procedures to help keep that culture thriving and moving forward? So really thinking about if you are the person that's been leading this change in your building or your district, what are you putting in place that will still stand after you leave? How are you creating that social justice and inclusion and equity to keep moving forward, even if you're not there? Who are you training? Who are you going to have there to keep that going? What professional development is in place for faculty that comes in at the beginning of the year or in the middle of the year? How do you keep those trainings going throughout? Do you have professional development that reoccurs throughout the year for onboarding in the middle of the year or the beginning of the year? What is there to keep training going, refreshers going? What are your staples? Those are the things that you as an administrator need to think of. So I said we would come back to the barriers. In thinking about our next steps, what are the barriers? Thinking about where you are now in this process as an administrator or as a teacher. These are some common barriers, but what are the barriers that you see in your schools or in your district? Or do you have any barriers? Go ahead and speak up or put in chat if you can think of any barriers, or are these some of the barriers that you see? Okay. It said our biggest barrier was the first one, not enough time built into the schedule for co-teachers to plan together. Not enough time. I think a lot of buildings I've talked to, that's been the thing, was the time for planning. Especially with, shortages for teachers. A lot of teachers are covering and that kind of thing. So consistent time sometimes as well. Thanks, Barry. So while you're kind of mulling that over or thinking about it, and some of you may not have barriers or may not be as into it to find those barriers. Maybe some of you don't have barriers. That would be great. Whoops. Some of the problems and some possible solutions are listed here. So for lack of time, sometimes the use of technology, which kind of came out of COVID, using like a Google Drive or finding time to talk over a Zoom or that kind of thing, that again came out of COVID. That has been helpful. And there are some, I think, planning time. Plan Time is another kind of, it's a software program, but those things have been helpful for teachers to use. So those are some possible solutions for those that are common ones. Hopefully you're not running into barriers. And this is kind of just summarizing, when it's implemented with fidelity, and I think we're getting better at implementing with fidelity, there are more educational opportunities for all, and it reduces the stigma for students with disabilities. We've got more cohesive educational programs and less lost instructional time when we implement co-teaching with fidelity. There are many, many benefits. We listed a lot earlier. And when we do it, there are just benefits for our entire student body. We know our kids learn better, all our kids learn better when we include all types of students. So setting up the program sometimes is hard. There are some barriers. Building those relationships, finding the time, finding the space. But when we look at doing it, it is rewarding for everyone. So I think if you're an administrator and you haven't done it, looking at those next steps of how to start it, that's what you want to do. And once you get it started, how to keep it going, even without you. Should you decide to move on, that is that next thought in the professional development, the sustainability. And keeping your stellar teams together, that's key. Are there any questions or does anybody have any comments they'd like to share? I think we're right at our time. Everybody's been pretty quiet today, so we had a lot to get through, but I wanted to cover both teacher and administrator roles. If anybody has anything they'd like to share privately, I'll stay on for a moment. Or if you want to contact me later, that's okay too. Does anybody have anything they'd like to share out loud? Thank you all. I appreciate you putting up with my hoarse voice, and my cold brain here. Thank you very much for attending. I appreciate you all. And there's the link to the survey. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Aisha. And if you do the survey, you can get your COA and your attendance hours there. I appreciate each of you and thank you so much